Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Invention of Russia, From Gorbachev's Freedom to Putin's War, by Arkady Ostrovsky, narrated by Michael Page. Prologue: A Silent Procession. It was after midnight, and I was making final changes to this book when I learned that Boris Nemtsov, a liberal politician once groomed to be president of Russia, had been shot 6 times in the back on a bridge just yards away from the Kremlin. It was the most resonant political assassination in Russia's post-Soviet history, and it did not seem real. I knew Nemtsov well. He was more than a journalistic contact. Of all the Russian politicians I kept in touch with, he was the only one I considered a friend. He was charismatic, determined, honest, unpretentious, and very full of life. Now his large body lay on the wet asphalt, covered by black rubbish bags, with the cupolas of St. Basil's behind him. His was a postcard murder. Those who killed Nemtsov acted with impudence and did not expect to be arrested. When one of them was detained, he turned out to be an officer linked to Ramzan Kadyrov, Chechnya's former rebel installed by Russian President Vladimir Putin to keep the territory under his thumb. Kadyrov had sworn his personal loyalty to Putin, helped annex Crimea, and promptly defended the alleged killer as a true patriot. Nemtsov's murder marked the first anniversary of Russia's annexation of Crimea and its hybrid war against Ukraine. Now the violence ignited over the border had returned to the homeland. The war in Ukraine, stoked and fanned by the Kremlin, has not just devastated a former Soviet republic that dared to break free from its grip, it has devastated Russia itself, its sense of decency and moral fiber. It has turned xenophobia and aggression into a norm and civility into an offense. Nemtsov was a good man who tried to stop the war. In the state media, this has earned him the title of national traitor and American stooge. In the weeks before his death, he was demonized on television. Soon after that, hate banners carrying his image were hung on building facades with the words, "Fifth Column, Aliens Among Us." 6 days before Nemtsov's death, I watched thousands of people, some paid, others not, marching through the heart of Moscow bearing slogans denouncing Ukraine, the West, and Russian liberals. Muscle-bound toughs representing Kadyrov carried signs proclaiming "Putin and Kadyrov prevent Maidan in Russia," alongside photographs of Nemtsov identifying him as the organizer of Maidan. Maidan had become shorthand for Maidan Nezalezhnosti, or Independence Square in Kiev, the epicenter of Ukraine's revolution. I was born and bred in the Soviet Union and have worked for many years in Russia, but never before had I seen such levels of hysteria. This was something out of a documentary of 1930s Germany. As Nemtsov said in an interview recorded hours before his death, Russia is quickly turning into a fascist state. We already have propaganda modeled on Nazi Germany's. We also have a nucleus of assault brigades like the Nazi SA. Andrei Sakharov, Russia's great humanist and nuclear physicist, once argued that a country that violates human rights at home poses a threat to international security. In fact, it was partly Sakharov's knowledge of the potential impact of his thermonuclear device that turned him into a human rights activist. Russia today has no Sakharov. It has propagandists who talk about the use of nuclear arms with flippancy unimaginable in the Soviet period. Russia can reduce America to nuclear ash, boasted Dmitry Kiselov, the anchor of Russia's main television channel, Rossiya. After Stalin's death, the personal power of Soviet leaders was checked by the collective Politburo. Now Kiselov said a decision to use nuclear arms will be taken personally by Putin, who has the undoubted support of the Russian people. In a documentary about the return of Crimea, Putin admitted he was ready to make such a decision if NATO forces tried to interfere in the peninsula. The situation in Russia today is more dangerous than it was in the Cold War. The Soviet Union and America both emerged as winners from the Second World War and did not suffer from an inferiority complex. But Russia's current rulers were shaped by what they consider to be their loss of the Cold War and their feeling of rejection by the West, despite all their fabulous wealth. A mixture of hostility and jealousy has triumphed in Russia 30 years after Mikhail Gorbachev ended the Cold War, opened up the country and proclaimed the supremacy of human values over the interests of the state. The withdrawal of Soviet forces from Eastern Europe, which today is deemed a fatal mistake in official textbooks, was greeted with approval not just by the West but by Russia's own people, those same people who now approve of Putin's bombing of Syria, designed to demonstrate the country's resurgence and to project power outside the former Soviet territory for the first time since its defeat in Afghanistan. The end of communism gave many the hope that Russia would become a normal country and join the civilized world. As a drama student in Moscow at the time, I remember that feeling of hope. It was one of the happiest periods of my life. The world was opening before me, and my friends and I eagerly embraced our new freedom to travel and ability to make contact with people from the other side of the Iron Curtain. Theatre companies from Europe brought their productions to Moscow, and we could not only see them, we could talk to their actors and directors. I remember the excitement of meeting 2 Swedish actors from Ingmar Bergman's company. These were my first proper foreigners, and the fact that I could talk to them was more important than what we said. For me, the shortages of food in the shops were fully compensated by this exhilarating new sense of possibility. History was being made in Moscow, and we were in the middle of it. Looking back at that period, I realize now that this sense of excitement was experienced by a narrow circle of people. For the majority of the population, the collapse of the Soviet Union was associated with uncertainty and a sharp decline in living standards. But at the time, many of my generation felt that the future belonged to us. Travelling from Moscow to England by train for the first time through Eastern Europe, passing through East and West Berlin, no longer divided by the wall, I felt proud to be Russian. I was coming from a free country that no longer oppressed others, and I could finally discover the world. The attempted coup by hardline communists in August 1991 seemed like a last spasm of the old regime, and its defeat triggered a celebration of freedom. On Christmas Day 1991, I watched the Soviet flag go down over the Kremlin towers and listened to Gorbachev bid farewell to the Soviet Union. Destiny so determined that when I found myself at the helm of this state, it was already clear that something was wrong in this country. We had a lot of everything: land, oil and gas, other natural resources, and intellect and talent in abundance. But we were living much worse off than people in other industrialized countries, suffocating in the shackles of the bureaucratic command system. All the half-hearted reforms fell through, one after another. This country was going nowhere, and we couldn't possibly go on living the way we had. We had to change everything radically. Gorbachev could not save the country, but he paid tribute to what had been achieved. Free elections have become a reality. Free press, freedom of worship, representative legislatures, and a multi-party system have all become a reality. Human rights are being treated as a supreme principle and top priority. We're now living in a new world. An end has been put to the Cold War and to the arms race. We have opened ourselves up to the rest of the world, abandoned the practices of interfering in others' internal affairs and using troops outside this country, and we have been rewarded with trust, solidarity, and respect. We have paid with our history and our tragic experiences for these democratic achievements, and they are not to be abandoned, whatever the circumstances and whatever the pretexts. The journey described in this book is also my personal journey. In 1992, a year after the Soviet Union ceased to exist, I left to do a PhD in English literature at Cambridge, grateful to Gorbachev for giving me the freedom to travel, study, and write. A decade later, I returned to Moscow as a journalist, first with the Financial Times, then with The Economist, a foreign correspondent in my native land. By that time, Russia had a former KGB man for a president, who marked his first anniversary in the Kremlin by restoring the Soviet anthem, and who began to bring back the Cold War order. In this process of restoration, Russia has not returned to the Soviet past, but it has arrived at a new junction. Old-fashioned nationalism in neo-Stalinist garb has become the most powerful force in Russian society, threatening its own citizens as well as its neighbors. While reporting from Moscow, my brother and I translated Tom Stoppard's Coast of Utopia, his trilogy about 19th-century Russian thinkers, and our translation was staged at the Moscow Youth Theatre. Gorbachev, who was shaped by the ideas of Alexander Herzen and Vissarion Belinsky, came to see the play and was invited on stage. He seemed to belong among those Russian characters who also dreamed of a liberal and dignified European Russia. The production, which is still being performed in Moscow, is a reminder that there was a time when patriotism did not translate into xenophobia, when pragmatism did not justify dishonor, and when irony did not rule out love for your country. How did Russia get from 1991 to 2016? Has a counter-revolution taken place? If so, when did that happen, and how did I miss it? Over the past quarter-century, Russian thinkers have been obsessed with trying to find the particular point in time when the country took a wrong step. They view history as a tape that can be wound backward and forward in order to identify that crucial junction, so that a different route can then be tried. History is not reversible, but it was not predetermined either. There was no one single event after the collapse of the Soviet Union that made Russia's current condition inevitable. And while it may be tempting to blame everything on Putin, that would be missing the point. While he bears enormous responsibility, he is as much a consequence as a cause of Russia's ills. In this book, I have sought an answer to the question of how Russia got here by following its story and its dominant ideas over the past quarter-century, hoping to illuminate key turning points in its history. My main characters are not politicians or economists, but those who generated the meaning of the country, who composed the storyline, who produced and broadcast it, and in the process led the country from freedom to war. They are ideologists, journalists, editors, television executives, people in charge of the message and the media. From the time of Gorbachev's perestroika onward, journalists have been more than transmitters of ideas and designs conceived elsewhere. They became the source of these designs and ideas, and as such, they are responsible both for Russia's emergence from authoritarianism and for its descent back into it. This book is not a history of Russian media, however. Rather, it is the story of the country they have invented. Russia is an idea-centric country, and the media play a disproportionately important role in it. As Ivan Pavlov, Russia's Nobel Prize-winning physiologist famous for his work on conditional reflexes, observed in a lecture he gave in the cold and hungry Petrograd of 1918, the task of every mind is to comprehend reality accurately. But in Russia, he remarked, we are mostly interested in words and have little concern for reality. He blamed the mind of the intelligentsia, the brain of the country, for leading Russia into the Bolshevik Revolution. As with any utopia, communism disregarded reality, and as a pseudo-religion, it operated through words and images. It is not for nothing that Vladimir Lenin, the Bolshevik leader who sacrificed the country to the communist idea, described himself as a journalist. The Bolsheviks began by taking over the printing presses and guarding their monopoly over printed words. Words were used to conceal facts and to construct an alternative reality. Lies and repression were the two main pillars that upheld the Soviet system. Words justified repression. Repression enforced the words. It worked like an arch. The mind dealt with the disconnection between signals and real life by developing doublethink, a condition described by George Orwell in 1984. But the system that emerged by the word also vanished by the word. The Soviet Union expired not only because it ran out of money, but also because it ran out of words. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrestled with the Soviet system, knew there was only one way to defeat it. "Live not by lies," he wrote on the day of his arrest. The paradox was that the opening up of the media could be achieved only by engaging in half-truths. But when reality burst through that opening in the form of live television broadcasts and uncensored publications, the Soviet Union crumbled. Whoever controlled the media also controlled the country. To take the Kremlin, you must take television, Alexander Yakovlev, the main ideologist of perestroika, once said. This was no metaphor, for the fiercest and deadliest battles that unfolded in the lead-up to and aftermath of the Soviet disintegration were for the television tower. In the 1990s, television and newspapers were in the hands of pro-Western liberals who set out to project a new reality by means of the media. But in the end, they used the media to enrich themselves and to consolidate power. Television turned Putin, an unknown KGB operative, into Russia's president within months of his eruption into the national consciousness. His first step as he settled in the Kremlin was to take control over television. Only then could he seize the commanding heights of the economy. Television has been the main tool of his power, his magic wand that substituted a counterfeit image for reality. As Putin's friend Silvio Berlusconi once said, "What is not on TV does not exist." Putin took this one step further. Things that did not exist could be turned into reality by harnessing the power of television. This alchemical power was displayed vividly both in the annexation of Crimea and in the war in Ukraine. I was in Crimea when polite green men, as Russian soldiers with no markings would soon be known, turned up under the pretense of protecting the local Russian population from Ukrainian fascists. In Sebastopol, a large crowd of people waved flags and danced to old Soviet songs in celebration of their liberation. Yet the enemy was nowhere to be seen. "We saw them on television," one man explained. Words and images no longer signaled reality. Rather, reality was constructed to validate what had been seen. Or, to put it more simply, to provide the right picture. "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war," William Randolph Hearst famously told his correspondent in Cuba in 1897. As is often the way in its history, Russia pushed this concept to its extreme. Television has been the primary weapon in Putin's hybrid war against Ukraine. It created a narrative that was then enacted on the ground at the cost of thousands of lives. Television news has turned into a war serial. Yet those who conduct Russia's aerial battles are not some crazy nationalists bent on the idea of world domination, nor are they helpless pawns in the hands of a despot. They are sophisticated and erudite men who started their careers during Gorbachev's perestroika and prospered in Yeltsin's 1990s, but who now act as demiurges, creators of reality. The purpose of the show they have staged is to perpetuate the power and wealth of Putin and his elite, of which they are a part. In doing so, they have stirred the lowest instincts and intoxicated the country with the aggression, hatred, and chauvinism that made Boris Nemtsov's murder possible. Shortly before Nemtsov was shot dead, he was handing out leaflets for an anti-war rally he had organized. The rally turned into his funeral march. 2 days after his murder, I walked with my wife and 9-year-old son among tens of thousands of Muscovites to the place where he was killed. It was a silent procession. 1. In the beginning was the Word. 1. Fathers and Sons. The Last Supper. 5 minutes before 7 p.m. on December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev walked briskly along a Kremlin corridor into a wood-paneled room teeming with photographers, technicians, and cameramen to record his last speech as President of the USSR. Gorbachev sat at the desk, put down his papers, and looked at his watch. "Oh, we still have plenty of time," he told the cameramen, who were too overwhelmed with the historic significance of the moment to appreciate the irony. The Soviet Union was about to expire, and Mr. Gorbachev's presidency with it. Waiting for the clock to strike the hour, A large grey-haired man energetically approached the desk and leaned over Gorbachev. "Don't sign it now," he told him. "First, you will say, 'I want to sign a decree relinquishing my duties.' The camera will show a close-up and will then move back. Then you will start your speech." The man was Yegor Yakovlev, the head of Soviet television and a former editor of Moskovskaya Novosti, the Moscow News, the mouthpiece of Gorbachev's perestroika. Yakovlev had persuaded Gorbachev that his final days in office should be recorded by Soviet and American television crews and turned into a documentary, Ukhod, Departure. Yakovlev and Gorbachev had spent the past hour in Gorbachev's office reminiscing about their mutual Soviet past. Now Gorbachev looked up at Yakovlev as if he were seeing him for the first time. Gorbachev leafed through the papers. "I'll simply sign it now, and we will move on," he said, turning abruptly to his press secretary for a pen and trying it on an empty sheet of paper. "A softer one would be better," he said. The president of CNN, who had flown to Moscow to interview Gorbachev on his last day in office, held out his pen. Gorbachev accepted it and, with a journalist's pen, signed his abdication from power. Nobody in the room noticed the moment. The clock struck 7 p.m., and Gorbachev began to speak. At first his voice sounded soft and forced, almost trembling, but gradually it became more controlled. As one of the people present in the room recalled, once Gorbachev had finished speaking, Yegor Yakovlev rushed up to him. He was unhappy with Gorbachev's intonation and suggested that the speech should be re-recorded. Gorbachev looked at Yakovlev in astonishment. It did not just seem tactless, it was absurd. A historic event was not a staged performance. It could not be repeated, just as the empire could not be restored or the clock turned back. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, to be replaced with the Russian tricolour. The country that had come into being after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 had ceased to exist. Minutes later, Gorbachev passed the nuclear briefcase to Yeltsin. Most of the television journalists who followed Gorbachev around in his last days were foreign. The Russian ones had lost interest. Bizarrely, the film about Gorbachev's departure was shot by an ABC crew, with some assistance from Soviet television and narrated by an American journalist, Richard Kaplan. This was the result of a difference in attitude between Russian and Western journalists, not only toward Gorbachev, but also toward historic media events. Soviet training did not leave space for the proclaiming of a historic event of this kind, since historic events were defined by the party and the state. The Western media, which prioritized the personal over the ideological, and had already elevated Gorbachev to a world figure, of course treated his resignation as a huge moment, even a tragedy. The Russian public did not see it in those terms. A few hours later, in an empty and largely dark Kremlin, Gorbachev and 5 others gathered around a table in the walnut reception room for a simple meal that resembled a wake or a last supper. Among them was Alexander Yakovlev, unrelated to Yegor by blood and temperament. The role played by Alexander Yakovlev in the dismantling of the Soviet Union was second only to Gorbachev's. He was the spiritual leader of Gorbachev's perestroika. One of the most senior figures in the Soviet Politburo, Yakovlev was formally in charge of propaganda and ideology, and was in effect responsible for smashing both. He was also the author of Glasnost, the most successful part of Gorbachev's reforms, which opened up the media by removing ideological constraints, knocking out one of the key elements of the Soviet construction. Alexander Yakovlev's relationship with Gorbachev was complex and often fractious. When Yakovlev died, Gorbachev did not attend his funeral, although Yakovlev had been by his side at one of the most difficult moments in his life. Shortly before Gorbachev's television announcement, Yakovlev had mediated an 8-hour-long meeting between Gorbachev and Yeltsin, at which power was transferred from the last president of the USSR to the first president of Russia. Yakovlev recalled the resolute step of Boris Yeltsin as he walked down the long Kremlin corridor as if on a parade ground. It was the walk of a victor, and the weakness of Gorbachev. When Yakovlev walked into Gorbachev's office, he found him lying down on a sofa. There were tears in his eyes. "You see, Sasha, that is how it is." Thus spoke a man, perhaps in the hardest minutes of his life. I tried to console him, but I myself was choking. A feeling that something unfair had happened was suffocating me. A man who had brought drastic change to the world, who only yesterday ruled the fates of billions of people on Earth, today was a helpless victim of the cruelty and capriciousness of history. The irony was that it was Gorbachev and Yakovlev who had set this history in motion. Next to Alexander Yakovlev at Gorbachev's dinner table sat his namesake, Yegor Yakovlev. Despite their common last name, the two Yakovlevs rarely got confused with each other. The elder Yakovlev was always referred to as Alexander Nikolaevich. The younger one was always Yegor, rarely with his patronymic and often without adding his surname. When he died, obituaries referred to him as Yegor. This was partly a reflection of his mythological status. He was not just the editor-in-chief of Moskovskaya Novosti, he was simply the chief editor. Legends were, and still are, told in Russia about Yegor's talent for nurturing authors, his oozing of irresistible charm that affected men and women alike, his habit of falling in and out of love, his despotic and dictatorial manner, his sparkle. The two Yakovlevs were not related, but the bond between them was no less real for that. Yegor saw Alexander, Uncle Sasha, as a patron saint and a father figure who enabled him to stretch the limits of perestroika and who protected him when he crossed them. Although the difference between them in age was only 6 years, they belonged to different generations, separated by the experience of the Second World War. Alexander was born in 1923 and fought in the war. Yet the two Yakovlevs were to die within 1 month of each other. Yegor on September 18, 2005, and Alexander on October 18, 2005. Gorbachev spoke at Yegor's funeral with sincerity unusual for a politician. "I counted him among my closest people and friends. One could always rely on him. He was close to me in spirit, in his attitude to life and to people. We remember the role his newspaper, Moskovskaya Novosti, has played. Yegor and everything that he did was a yardstick by which people measured themselves." Moskovskaya Novosti was a newspaper that tested Soviet ideology to destruction. The Soviet system rested on violence and ideology. The death of Stalin in 1953 put an end to mass terror and repression. Violence administered by the security services on behalf of the Communist Party became more sporadic and was now used mainly against dissidents. Nikita Khrushchev, who seized power after Stalin's death, shifted the weight of the system from repression to ideology, promising to build communism by 1980. Writers and ideologists were to play a more important role in this than the security services. As Khrushchev told Soviet writers in 1957, "Just as a soldier cannot fight without ammunition, the party cannot conduct a war without print. Print is our main ideological weapon, and we cannot pass it into unreliable hands. It must be kept in the most reliable, most trustworthy hands, which would use this weapon to destroy the enemies of the working class." By 1980, the ideology was completely rigid and lifeless. The economy was barely functioning, and the grand utopia of building communism was dead. As Alexander Bovin, a speechwriter for Leonid Brezhnev, who replaced Khrushchev in 1964, and one of the leading perestroika-era journalists, wrote, "Only the lies, the end product of ideologists, provided the effectiveness of the violence, real or potential, which the system had rested upon." Once the ideology and propaganda started crumbling, the system came down, crushing those who had aimed to reform it. The Soviet collapse was determined not so much by the economic meltdown, by a revolutionary uprising in the capital, or by a struggle for independence on the periphery of the empire, at least not directly, as it was by the dismantling of lies. Without lies, the Soviet Union had no legitimacy. The ruling elite no longer saw any reason to defend a system that constrained their personal enrichment and comforts. The paradox was that the dismantling of propaganda was not...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?